Hello, 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 hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are reading Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, starting with part 8, chapter 1. We are in the last part, finally. But first, okay, you guys, the somebody asked me today who knew that I was reading Anna Karenina and was like, "How is it going?" And I was like, "Let me tell you, we are starting the last part. We're starting the last part. We only have 21 chapters." And then I just went on this like tirade about how long Anna Karenina is and how it could have done with another round of editing. And I'm ready. Also, we were left on like a little bit of a cliffhanger. Are we ready to talk about this? Are we ready to hop into the Tolstoy hole? I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that, but previously on Anna Karenina, we mostly hung out with Anna and we were mostly in her head and her just mental health decline. And she has been, going back and forth between healthy thoughts, but mostly very unhealthy thoughts, and even like to end everybody's suffering, and so that she finally feels love, she's just going to end her life. And so she's thought that a couple times last time. And the way that we ended it was with Anna at the train station. She was going to go see Vronsky. She was going to tell him everything that she feels. And then at the train station, she's like, you know what? I remember when I first met Vronsky, somebody threw themselves in front of the train. I'm going to do that. And she misses the first train, and so she waits for the second train. And does she do it? It kind of is a little ambiguous. I feel like the ending of where we left off could have been read either way, where yes, she did, and then that begs the question of like, okay, but like what is this whole extra part going to be? Is she just not gonna be in it? Or yes, she did, and she just like stubbed a toe, or she didn't act like it didn't actually go through. She tripped, her bag stopped her, like something. I don't know. And you know what? It's a good thing we have a whole nother part to find out what happens. Part 8, Chapter 1. Almost 2 months had passed. The hot summer was half over, but Sergei Ivanovich was only just preparing to leave Moscow. Sergei Ivanovich's life had not been uneventful during this time. A year ago, he had finished his book, the fruit of 6 years' labor, Sketch of a Survey of the Principles and Forms of Government in Europe and Russia. Several selections of this book and its introduction had appeared in periodical publications, and other parts had been read by Sergei Ivanovich to persons of his circle, so that the leading ideas of the work could not be completely novel to the public. But still, Sergei Ivanovich had expected that on its appearance his book would be sure to make a serious impression on society, and if it did not cause a revolution in social science, it would, at any rate, make a great stir in the scientific world. After the most conscientious revision, the book had last year been published and had been distributed among booksellers. Though he asked no one about it, reluctantly and with feigned indifference answered his friends' inquiries as to how the book was going, and did not even inquire of the booksellers how the book was selling. Sergei Ivanovich was all on the alert, with strained attention, watching for the first impression his book would make in the world and in literature. But a week passed, a second, a third, and in society no impression whatever could be detected. His friends, who were specialists and savants, occasionally, unmistakably from politeness, alluded to it. The rest of his acquaintances, not interested in a book on a learned subject, did not talk of it at all. The society generally, just now especially absorbed in other things, was absolutely indifferent. In the press, too, for a whole month, there was not a word about his book. Sergei Ivanovich had calculated to a nicety the time necessary for writing a review, but a month passed, and a second, and still there was silence. Only in the Northern Beetle, in a comic article on the singer Drabanti, who had lost his voice, there was a contemptuous allusion to Koznichev's book, suggesting that the book had been long ago seen through by everyone and was a subject of general ridicule. At last, in the third month, a critical article appeared in a serious review. Sergei Ivanovich knew the author of the article. He had met him once at Golubtsov's. The author of the article was a young man, an invalid, very bold as a writer, but extremely deficient in breeding and shy in personal relations. In spite of his absolute contempt for the author, it was with complete respect that Sergei Ivanovich set about reading the article. The article was awful. The critic had undoubtedly put an interpretation upon the book which could not possibly be put on it. But he had selected quotations not so adroitly that for people who had not read the book, and obviously scarcely anyone had read it, it seemed absolutely clear that the whole book was nothing but a medley of high-flown phrases, not even, as suggested by marks of interrogation, used appropriately, and that the author of the book was a person absolutely without knowledge of the subject. And all this was so wittily done that Sergei Ivanovich would not have disowned such wit himself. But that was just what was so awful. In spite of the scrupulous conscientiousness with which Sergei Ivanovich verified the correctness of the critic's arguments, he did not, for a minute, stop to ponder over the faults and mistakes which were ridiculed, but unconsciously he began immediately trying to recall every detail of his meeting and conversation with the author of the article. Didn't I offend him in some way? Sergei Ivanovich wondered. And remembering that when they met, he had corrected the young man about something he had said that betrayed ignorance, Sergei Ivanovich found the clue to explain the article. This article was followed by a deadly silence about the book, both in the press and in conversation. And Sergei Ivanovich saw that his 6 years' task, toiled at with such love and labor, had gone, leaving no trace. Sergei Ivanovich's position was still more difficult from the fact that, since he had finished his book, he had had no more literary work to do, such as had hitherto occupied the greater part of his time. Sergei Ivanovich was clever, cultivated, healthy, and energetic, and he did not know what use to make of his energies. Conversations in drawing rooms, in meetings, assemblies, and committees, everywhere where talk was possible, took up part of his time. But being used for years to town life, he did not waste all his energies in talk, as his less experienced younger brother did when he was in Moscow. He had a great deal of leisure and intellectual energy still to dispose of. Fortunately for him, at this period so difficult for him from the failure of his book, the various public questions of the dissenting sects, of the American alliance, of the Samara famine, of exhibitions, and of spiritualism were definitely replaced in public interest by the Slavonic question, which had hitherto rather languidly interested society, and Sergei Ivanovich, who had been one of the first to raise this subject, threw himself into it, heart and soul. In the circle to which Sergei Ivanovich belonged, Nothing was talked of or written about just now but the Servian War. Everything that the idle crowd usually does to kill time was done now for the benefit of the Slavonic states. Balls, concerts, dinners, matchboxes, ladies' dresses, beer, restaurants, everything testified to sympathy with the Slavonic peoples. From much of what was spoken and written on the subject, Sergei Ivanovich differed on various points. He saw that the Slavonic question had become one of those fashionable distractions which succeeded one another in providing society with an object and in occupation. He saw, too, that a great many people were taking up the subject from motives of self-interest and self-advertisement. He recognized that the papers published a great deal that was superfluous and exaggerated, with the sole aim of attracting attention and outbidding one another. He saw that in this general movement, those who thrust themselves most forward and shouted the loudest were men who had failed and were smarting under a sense of injury. Generals without armies, ministers not in the ministry, journalists not on any paper, party leaders without followers. He saw that there was a great deal in it that was frivolous and absurd, but he saw and recognized an unmistakable growing enthusiasm, uniting all classes, with which it was impossible not to sympathize. The massacre of men who were fellow Christians and of the same Slavonic race excited sympathy for the sufferers and indignation against the oppressors, and the heroism of the Servians and Montenegrins struggling for a great cause begot in the whole people a longing to help their brothers, not in word, but in deed. But in this there was another aspect that rejoiced Sergei Ivanovich. That was the manifestation of public opinion. The public had definitely expressed its desire. The soul of the people had, as Sergei Ivanovich said, found expression. And the more he worked in this cause, the more incontestable it seemed to him that it was a cause destined to assume vast dimensions, to create an epoch. He threw himself heart and soul into the service of this great cause and forgot to think about his book. His whole time now was engrossed by it, so that he could scarcely manage to answer all the letters and appeals addressed to him. He worked the whole spring and part of the summer, and it was only in July that he prepared to go away to his brothers in the country. He was going both to rest for a fortnight and in the very heart of the people, in the farthest wilds of the country, to enjoy the sight of that uplifting of the spirit of the people, of which, like all residents in the capital and big towns, he was fully persuaded. Katavasov had long been meaning to carry out his promise to stay with Levin, and so he was going with him. End of chapter 1. All right, so after 6 years, the book is finally published, and we are expecting a big splash because this has just changed everything. And, we are expecting changes in social environments, but also scientific changes, and it's going to ring everybody's bell and everybody's going to change, and that's not what happens at all. At all. And people are politely asking Sergei Ivanovich how the book is going, and he's just like, and he has read a critique by somebody that he met, and the critique is scathing, but in a very witty way, and just says that the book is just throwing out very fanciful terms and big words without actually knowing anything, without having any research, which we know isn't true. There has been research done, but maybe not the right kind of research, or maybe not done so great. So we're getting that, and then also, while the book is being published and not doing great, we're getting changes in society, which is always interesting in real life, and then also in bookish translations of how social change happens. He just used Wikipedia. You can't do that. You have to go to the sources that are listed below. Part 8, Chapter 2. Sergei Ivanovich and Katavasov had only just reached the station of the Kursk line, which was particularly busy and full of people that day, when, looking round for the groom who was following with their things, they saw a party of volunteers driving up in 4 cabs. Ladies met them with bouquets of flowers, and followed by the rushing crowd, they went into the station. One of the ladies who had met the volunteers came out of the hall and addressed Sergei Ivanovich. "You come to see them off?" she asked in French. "No, I'm going away myself, Princess, to my brother's for a holiday. Do you always see them off?" said Sergei Ivanovich with a hardly perceptible smile. "Oh, that would be impossible," answered the princess. "It is true that 800 have been sent from us already. Malvinsky wouldn't believe me." "More than 800. If you reckon those who have been sent not directly from Moscow, over 1,000, answered Sergei Ivanovich. "There, that's just what I said," exclaimed the lady. "And it's true, too, I suppose, that more than 1,000,000 have been subscribed?" "Yes, Princess." "What do you say to today's telegram? Beaten the Turks again?" "Yes, so I saw," answered Sergei Ivanovich. They were speaking of the last telegram, stating that the Turks had been for 3 days in succession beaten at all points and put to flight, and that tomorrow a decisive engagement was expected. "Ah, by the way, a splendid young fellow has asked leave to go, and they've made some difficulty. I don't know why. I meant to ask you. I know him. Please write a note about his case. He's being sent by Countess Lydia Ivanovna." Sergei Ivanovich asked for all the details the princess knew about the young man, and going into the first-class waiting room, wrote a note to the person on whom the granting of leave of absence depended, and handed it to the princess. "You know the Count Vronsky, the notorious one, is going by this train?" said the princess with a smile full of triumph and meaning, when he found her again and gave her the letter. "I had heard he was going, but I did not know when. By this train? I've seen him. He's there. There's only his mother seeing him off. It's the best thing, anyway, that he could do." "Yes, of course." While they were talking, the crowd streamed by them into the dining room. They went forward, too, and heard a gentleman with a glass in his hand delivering a loud discourse to the volunteers. "In the service of religion, humanity, and our brothers," the gentleman said, his voice growing louder and louder, "to this great cause, Mother Moscow dedicates you to her blessing. Jivio," he concluded, loudly and tearfully. Everyone shouted, "Jivio," and a fresh crowd dashed into the hall, almost carrying the princess off her legs. "Ah, princess, that was something like," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, suddenly appearing in the middle of the crowd and beaming upon them with a delighted smile. "Capitally, warmly said, wasn't it? Bravo! And Sergei Ivanovich, why, you ought to have said something, just a few words, to encourage them. You do that so well," he added with a soft, respectful, and discreet smile, moving Sergei Ivanovich forward a little by the arm. "No, I'm just off." "Where to?" "To the country, to my brother's," answered Sergei Ivanovich. "Then you'll see my wife. I've written to her, but you'll see her first. Please tell her that they've seen me and that it's all right, as the English say. She'll understand. Oh, and be so good as to tell her I'm appointed secretary of the committee. She'll understand. You know, les petites mesures de la vie humaine," he said, as it were apologizing to the princess. And Princess Mayakaya, not Liza, but Bibish, is sending 1,000 guns and 12 nurses. Did I tell you? Yes, I heard so, answered Koznishev indifferently. It's a pity you're going away, said Stepan Arkadyevitch. Tomorrow we're giving a dinner to two who are setting off, Dimer Bartnansky from Petersburg and our Veslovsky Grisha. They're both going. Veslovsky's only lately married. There's a fine fellow for you. Eh, princess? He turned to the lady. The princess looked at Koznishev without replying. But the fact that Sergei Ivanovich and the princess seemed anxious to get rid of him did not in the least disconcert Stepan Arkadyevitch. Smiling, he stared at the feather in the princess's hat and then about him as though he were going to pick something up. Seeing a lady approaching with a collecting box, he beckoned her up and put in a 5-ruble note. I can never see these collecting boxes unmoved while I've money in my pocket, he said. And how's about today's telegram? Fine chaps, those Montenegrins. You don't say so, he cried, when the princess told him that Vronsky was going by this train. For an instant, Stepan Arkadyevitch's face looked sad. But a minute later, when stroking his mustaches and swinging as he walked, he went into the hall where Vronsky was. He had completely forgotten his own despairing sobs over his sister's corpse, and he saw in Vronsky only a hero and an old friend. With all his faults, one can't refuse to do him justice, said the princess to Sergei Ivanovich as soon as Stepan Arkadyevitch has left them. What a typically Russian, Slav nature. Only I'm afraid I won't be pleasant for Vronsky to see him. Say what you will, I'm touched by that man's fate. Do talk to him a little on the way, said the princess. Yes, perhaps, if it happens so. I never liked him, but this atones for a great deal. He's not merely going himself, he's taking a squadron at his own expense. So I heard. A bell sounded. Everyone crowded to the doors. There he is, said the princess, indicating Vronsky, who, with his mother on his arm, walked by, wearing a long overcoat and wide-brimmed black hat. Oblonsky was walking beside him, talking eagerly of something. Vronsky was frowning and looking straight before him, as though he did not hear what Stepan Arkadyevitch was saying. Probably on Oblonsky's pointing them out, he looked round at the direction where the princess and Sergei Ivanovich were standing, and without speaking, lifted his hat. His face, aged and worn by suffering, looked stony. Going onto the platform, Vronsky left his mother and disappeared into a compartment. On the platform, there rang out, "God save the Tsar!" then shouts of "Hooray!" and "Jivyo!" One of the volunteers, a tall, very young man with a hollow chest, was particularly conspicuous, bowing and waving his felt hat and a nosegay over his head. Then 2 officers emerged, bowing, too, and a stout man with a big beard waving a greasy fourrage cap. End of chapter 2. That just seemed to end quite abruptly. All right. End of chapter 2. All right. Chapter 2, we are at the train station, and we're getting some gossip, which is always interesting, the way that Tolstoy is writing about other characters. Like, okay, we have not seen Anna. We have not gotten definite word of Anna or perspectives of people that, you know, we're deeply engaged with, like Vronsky, like Alexei Alexandrovich, even Kitty, even Kaban, Levin. But we have Sergei Ivanovich, who is Levin's brother, and he is going out to the country to go hang out with his brother and stay there for a while. And we run into Stepan Arkadyevitch, who just is one of those characters who's like one of the main characters, but is just like bopping back and forth in and out of everybody else's stories, and I think that's wonderful. I love that for him. And then we also have somebody, a princess, which it seems like everybody's a princess, but a princess who is like, did you hear that Count Vronsky is on this train? And he's only being sent off by his mama. And, talking to Sergei Ivanovich about the different, like, things that are being sent out, nurses, armament, people, all of these things. And then she's like, okay, and like, make sure that you talk to Vronsky. Please, thank you. And we do know also that Sergei Ivanovich did get the appointment, which is interesting. It is interesting. Yeah, Anna jumped in front of the train and just ended up in Narnia. She just ended up in Narnia. Okay, let's see. Anything else? Anything else that is... Oh, and I forgot to mention, we did get a time skip. What did it say? The chapter 1, it started with a time skip. 2 months. 2 months. 2 months. That's right. So, Anna's just been living in Narnia this whole time, and she's gonna pop back out. Chapter 3. Saying goodbye to the princess, Sergei Ivanovich was joined by Katavasov. Together they got into the carriage full of overflowing, and the train started. At Saritsino station, the train was met by a chorus of young men singing, "Hail to thee." Again, the volunteers bowed and poked their heads out, but Sergei Ivanovich paid no attention to them. He had had so much to do with the volunteers that the type was familiar to him and did not interest him. Katavasov, whose scientific work had prevented his having a chance of observing them hitherto, was very much interested in them and questioned Sergei Ivanovich. Sergei Ivanovich advised him to go into the second class and talk to them himself. At the next station, Katavasov acted on this suggestion. At the first stop, he moved into the second class and made the acquaintance of the volunteers. They were sitting in a corner of the carriage, talking loudly and obviously aware that the attention of the passengers and Katavasov, as he got in, was concentrated upon them. More loudly than all talked the tall, hollow-chested young man. He was unmistakably tipsy, and was relating some story that had occurred at his school. Facing him sat a middle-aged officer in the Austrian military jacket of the guard's uniform. He was listening with a smile to the hollow-chested youth and occasionally pulling him up. The third, in an artillery uniform, was sitting on a box beside them. A fourth was asleep. Entering into conversation with the youth, Katavasov learned that he was a wealthy Moscow merchant who had run through a large fortune before he was 22 and 20. Katavasov did not like him, because he was unmanly and effeminate and sickly. He was obviously convinced, especially now after drinking, that he was performing a heroic action, and he bragged of it in the most unpleasant way. The second, the retired officer, made an unpleasant impression, too, upon Katavasov. He was, it seemed, a man who had tried everything. He had been on a railway, had been a land steward, and had started factories, and he talked, quite without necessity, of all he had done, and used learned expressions quite inappropriately. The third, the artilleryman, on the contrary, struck Katavasov very favorably. He was a quiet, modest fellow, unmistakably impressed by the knowledge of the officer and the heroic self-sacrifice of the merchant, and saying nothing about himself. When Katavasov asked him what had impelled him to go to Servia, he answered modestly, "Oh, well, everyone's going. The Servians want help, too. I'm sorry for them." "Yes, you artillerymen especially are scarce there," said Katavasov. "Oh, I wasn't long in the artillery. Maybe they'll put me into the infantry or the cavalry." Into the infantry, when they need artillery more than anything, said Katavasov, fancying from the artilleryman's apparent age that he must have reached a fairly high grade. I wasn't long in the artillery. I'm a cadet retired, he said, and he began to explain how he had failed in his examination. All of this together made a disagreeable impression on Katavasov, and when the volunteers got out at a station for a drink, Katavasov would have liked to compare his unfavorable impression in conversation with someone. There was an old man in the carriage, wearing a military overcoat, who had been listening all the while to Katavasov's conversation with the volunteers. When they were left alone, Katavasov addressed him. What different positions they come from, all those fellows who are going off there, Katavasov said vaguely, not wishing to express his own opinion, and at the same time anxious to find out the old man's views. The old man was an officer who had served on 2 campaigns. He knew what makes a soldier, and judging by the appearance and the talk of those persons, by the swagger with which they had recourse to the bottle of the journey, he considered them poor soldiers. Moreover, he lived in a district town, and he was longing to tell how one soldier had volunteered from his town, a drunkard, and a thief whom no one would employ as a laborer. But knowing by experience that in the present condition of the public temper it was dangerous to express an opinion opposed to the general one, and especially to criticize the volunteers unfavorably, he too watched Katavasov without committing himself. Well, men are wanted there, he said, laughing with his eyes, and they fell to talking of the last war news, and each concealed from the other his perplexity as to the engagement expected next day, since the Turks had been beaten, according to the latest news, at all points. And so they parted, neither giving expression to his opinion. Katavasov went back to his own carriage, and with reluctant hypocrisy reported to Sergei Ivanovich his observations of the volunteers, from which it would appear that they were capital fellows. At a big station, at a town, the volunteers were again greeted with shouts and singing. Again, men and women with collecting boxes appeared, and provincial ladies brought bouquets to the volunteers and followed them into the refreshment room. But all this was on a much smaller and feebler scale than in Moscow. End of chapter 3. All right, so we're on the train, and Katavasov and Sergei Ivanovich are in first class, and in second class are a bunch of volunteers, warmen. And Sergei Ivanovich is not super interested in it, but what is his name? Katavasov, there we go. Katavasov is. And so Katavasov goes into the second class carriages just to talk. And as they're talking, both people in the conversation are not giving their actual opinions of the war efforts and of, what's happening, and no political opinions, no religious opinions, nothing is actually being said, because there would be repercussions if it doesn't go against the general norm of what you're supposed to be thinking and what you're supposed to be feeling about these actions. And at every stop, it seems like, people are cheering, people are shouting, they're singing, they are, waving, they're taking collections, all of these things. And Katavasov goes back, he reports back to Sergei Ivanovich and is just like, yeah, they're capital bros, everything's great. And the farther out they are from Moscow, the smaller the welcoming crowd is at each of the stops, which I think is interesting. I mean, yeah, there's probably just less people in the country. That's just how it goes. But is it also a reflection of the, not war effort, but support? Like, the farther away you get from a city, the less support you're getting. I'm just saying things. I'm just here with a microphone. Again, no Anna. Anna, can you hear me? It's very Russian. Chapter 4. While the train was stopping at the provincial town, Sergei Ivanovich did not go to the refreshment room, but walked up and down the platform. The first time he passed Vronsky's compartment, he noticed that the curtain was drawn over the window, but as he passed it the second time, he saw the old countess at the window. She beckoned to Koznishev. "I'm going, you see, taking him as far as Kursk," she said. "Yes, so I heard," said Sergei Ivanovich, standing in her window and peeping out. "What a noble act on his part," he added, noticing that Vronsky was not in the compartment. "Yes, after his misfortune, what was there for him to do? What a terrible thing it was," said Sergei Ivanovich. "Ah, what I have been through. But do get in, and what I have been through," she repeated when Sergei Ivanovich had got in and sat down beside her. "You can't conceive it. For 6 weeks he did not speak to anyone and would not touch food except when I implored him, and not for 1 minute could we leave him alone. We took away everything he could have used against himself. We lived on the ground floor, but there was no reckoning on anything. You know, of course, that he had shot himself once already on her account," she said, and the old lady's eyelashes twitched at the recollection. "Yes, hers was a fitting end for such a woman. Even the death she chose was low and vulgar." It's not for us to judge, Countess," said Sergei Ivanovich, "but I can understand that it has been very hard for you." "Don't speak of it. I was staying on my estate, and he was with me. A note was brought him. He wrote in answer and sent it off. We hadn't an idea that she was close by at the station. In the evening, I had only just gone to my room when my Mary told me a lady had thrown herself under the train. Something seemed to strike me at once. I knew it was she. The first thing I said was he was not to be told, but they told him already. His coachman was there and saw it all. When I ran into his room, he was beside himself. It was fearful to see him. He didn't say a word, but galloped off there. I don't know to this day what happened there, but he was brought back to death's door. I shouldn't have known him. Prostration complete, the doctor said. And that was followed almost by madness. Why talk of it?" said the Countess with a wave of her hand. "It was an awful time. No, say what you will, she was a bad woman. Why, what is the meaning of such desperate passions? It was all to show herself something out of the way. Well, and that she did do. She brought herself to ruin and 2 good men, her husband and my unhappy son." "And what did her husband do?" asked Sergei Ivanovich. "He has taken her daughter. Alexei was ready to agree to anything at first. Now it worries him terribly that he should have given his own child away to another man. But he can't take back his word. Karenina came to the funeral, but we tried to prevent his meeting Alexei. For him, for her husband, it was easier, anyway. She had set him free. My poor son was utterly given up to her. He had thrown up everything, his career, me, and even then she had no mercy on him, but of set purpose she made his ruin complete. No, say what you will, her very death was the death of a vile woman, of no religious feeling. God forgive me, but I can't help hating the memory of her, when I look at my son's misery." "And how is he now? It was a blessing from Providence for us, this Servian war. I'm old, and I don't understand the rights and wrongs of it, but it's come as a providential blessing to him. Of course, for me, as his mother, it's terrible, and what's worse, they say, ce n'est pas très bien vu à Petersburg, and it can't be helped. It was the one thing that could rouse him. Yashvin, a friend of his, he had lost all he had at cards, and he was going to Servia. He came to see him and persuaded him to go. Now it's an interest for him. Do, please, talk to him a little. I want to distract his mind. He's so low-spirited, and as bad luck would have it, he has a toothache, too. But he'll be delighted to see you. Please, do talk to him. He's waking up and down on that side. He's walking up and down on that side. Sergei Ivanovich said he would be very glad to, and crossed over to the other side of the station. End of chapter 4. Okay, so we get Mama Vronsky's side of the story of them not knowing that she was on the way. They got the telegram. He immediately responded and sent it off and didn't know that she was so close. And then they heard that there was a woman who had jumped in front of a train, and she's like, I just knew that it was Anna. And I said, don't you dare tell Vronsky. But they had already told Vronsky. So now she's like talking about like his, you know, his lowness, the things that he went through, and just how the husband, Alexei, didn't have it as bad, and, like, Vronsky has it way worse than Alexei Alexandrovich, and that, like, they no longer have the daughter, like, Anna's husband asked for the daughter, and just so many things, and it's like, oh, I just can't stand to see him like this. He wasted everything, like, he threw everything away for this girl, and this is what she does. So now Sergei Ivanovich, I'm assuming, is going to talk to Vronsky about it. Chapter 5. In the slanting evening shadows cast by the baggage piled up on the platform, Vronsky, in his long overcoat and slouch hat, with his hands in his pockets, strode up and down like a wild beast in a cage, turning sharply after 20 paces. Sergei Ivanovich fancied, as he approached him, that Vronsky saw him, but was pretending not to see. This did not affect Sergei Ivanovich in the slightest. He was, above all, personal considerations with Vronsky. At that moment, Sergei Ivanovich looked upon Vronsky as a man taking an important part in a great cause, and Koznishev thought it his duty to encourage him and express his approval. He went up to him. Vronsky stood still, looked intently at him, recognized him, and going a few steps forward to meet him, shook hands with him very warmly. Possibly you didn't wish to see me, said Sergei Ivanovich, but couldn't I be of use to you? There's no one I should less dislike seeing than you, said Vronsky. Excuse me, and there's nothing in life for me to like. I quite understand, and I merely meant to offer you my services, said Sergei Ivanovich, scanning Vronsky's face, full of unmistakable suffering. Wouldn't it be of use to you to have a letter to Rishtich, to Milan? Oh, no, Vronsky said, seeming to understand him with difficulty. If you don't mind, let's walk on. It's so stuffy among the carriages. A letter? No, thank you. To meet death one needs no letter of introduction, nor for the Turks, he said, with a smile that was merely of the lips. His eyes still kept their look of angry suffering. Well, yes, but you find it easier to get into relations which are, after all, essential, with anyone prepared to see you. But that's as you like. I am very glad to hear of your intention. There have been so many attacks made on the volunteers, and a man like you raises them in public estimation. My use as a man, said Vronsky, is that life's worth nothing to me. And after I've enough bodily energy to cut my way into their ranks and to trample on them or fall, I know that. I'm glad there's something to give my life for it's not simply useless, but loathsome to me. Anyone's welcome to it. And his jaw twitched impatiently from the incessant gnawing toothache that prevented him from even speaking with a natural expression. You will become another man, I predict, said Sergei Ivanovich, feeling touched. To deliver one's brother-men from bondage is an aim worth death and life. God grant you success outwardly, and inwardly peace, he added, and he held out his hand. Vronsky warmly pressed his outstretched hand. Yes, as a weapon I may be of some use, but as a man, I'm a wreck, he jerked out. He could hardly speak for the throbbing ache in his strong teeth that were like rows of ivory in his mouth. He was silent, and his eyes rested on the wheels of the tender, slowly and smoothly rolling along the rails. And all at once, a different pain, not an ache, but an inner trouble that set his whole being in anguish, made him for an instant forget his toothache. As he glanced at the tender and the rails under the influence of the conversation with a friend he had not met since his misfortune, he suddenly recalled her. That is, what was left of her when he had run like one distraught into the cloakroom of the railway station. On the table, shamelessly sprawled out among strangers, the blood-stained body so lately full of life, the head unhurt, dropping back with its weight of hair, and the curling tresses about the temples, and the exquisite face with red, half-opened mouth, the strange, fixed expression, piteous on the lips, and awful in the still open eyes, that seemed to utter that fearful phrase, that he would be sorry for it, that she had said when they were quarreling. And he tried to think of her as she was when he met her the first time, at a railway station too, mysterious, exquisite, loving, seeking and giving happiness, and not cruelly revengeful as he remembered her on that last moment. He tried to recall his best moments with her, but those moments were poisoned forever. He could only think of her as triumphant, successful in her menace as a wholly useless remorse never to be effaced. He lost all consciousness of toothache, and his face worked with sobs. Passing twice up and down beside the baggage in silence, and regaining his self-possession, he addressed Sergei Ivanovich calmly. You have had no telegrams since yesterday's? Yes, driven back for a third time, but a decisive engagement expected for tomorrow. And after talking a little more of King Milan's proclamation and the immense effect it might have, they parted, going to their carriages on hearing the second bell. End of chapter 5. These chapters are just zooming right past. Okay, so we have Sergei Ivanovich and Vronsky chatting, and we do get a little bit into Vronsky's headspace and how he is trying to only remember the good things and the good times of being with Anna. We get his memory of running to the train station and like finding her body like in front of all of these strangers, and he's trying so hard to have happy memories, but all of them have been poisoned because their last quarrel, she said like, you're gonna feel sorry, like this is like your fault type of a thing, like a very final, very vengeful last thing to yell at somebody. And so that is what he's thinking, and he's thinking, you won, Anna. You did it. You did the thing. Yeah. And it's so incredibly heavy and so incredibly complex, and job well done, Tolstoy. Chapter 6. Sergei Ivanovich had not telegraphed to his brother to send to meet him, as he did not know when he should be able to leave Moscow. Levin was not at home when Katavasov and Sergei Ivanovich, in a fly hired at the station, drove up to the steps of the Pokrovskoe house, as black as moors from the dust of the road. Kitty, sitting on the balcony with her father and sister, recognized her brother-in-law and ran down to him. "What a shame not to have let us know," she said, giving her hand to Sergei Ivanovich and putting her forehead up for him to kiss. "We drove here capitally and have not put you out, answered Sergei Ivanovich. "I'm so dirty, I'm afraid to touch you. I've been so busy, I didn't know when I should be able to tear myself away. And so you're still as ever enjoying your peaceful, quiet happiness," he said, smiling. "Out of the reach of the current in your peaceful backwater. Here's our friend Fyodor Vasilievich, who has succeeded in getting here at last." "I shall look like a human once I've been washed," said Katavasov in his jesting fashion, and he shook hands and smiled, his teeth flashing white. "Kostya will be delighted. He has gone to his settlement. It's time he should be home." "Busy as ever with his farming. It really is a peaceful backwater," said Katavasov, "while we in town think of nothing but the Servian war. Well, how does our friend look at it? He's sure not to think like other people." "Oh, I don't know. Like everybody else," Kitty answered, a little embarrassed, looking round at Sergei Ivanovich. "I'll send to fetch him. Papa's staying with us. He's only just come home from abroad." And making arrangements to send for Levin and for the guests to wash, one in his room and the other in what had been Dolly's, and given orders for their luncheon, Kitty ran out onto the balcony, enjoying the freedom and rapidity of movement of which she had been deprived during the months of her pregnancy. "It's Sergei Ivanovich and Katavasov, a professor," she said. "Oh, that's not a bore in this heat," said the prince. "No, Papa, he's very nice, and Kostya's very fond of him," Kitty said with a deprecating smile, noticing the irony on her father's face. "Oh, I didn't say anything." "You go to them, darling," said Kitty to her sister, "and entertain them. They saw Stiva at the station. He was quite well, and I must run to Mitya. As ill luck would have it, I haven't fed him since tea. He's awake now and sure to be screaming." And feeling a rush of milk, she hurried to the nursery. This was not a mere guess. Her connection with the child was still so close that she could gauge by the flow of her milk his need for food, and knew for certain he was hungry. She knew he was crying before she reached the nursery, and he was indeed crying. She heard him and hastened, but the faster she went, the louder he screamed. It was a fine, healthy scream, hungry and impatient. "Has he been screaming long, nurse? Very long?" said Kitty hurriedly, seating herself on a chair and preparing to give the baby food. "But give me him quickly. Oh, nurse, how tiresome you are. There, tie the cap afterwards, do." The baby's greedy scream was passing into sobs. "But you can't imagine so, ma'am," said Agafea Mikhailovna, who was almost always to be found in the nursery. "He must be put straight." "Oh, ooh," she chanted over him, paying no attention to the mother. The nurse brought the baby to his mother. Agafea Mikhailovna followed him, with a face dissolving with tenderness. "He knows me. He knows me. In God's faith, Katerina Alexandrovna, ma'am, he knew me," Agafea Mikhailovna cried above the baby's screams. But Kitty did not hear her words. Her impatience kept growing, like the baby's. Their impatience hindered things for a while. The baby could not get hold of the breast right and was furious. At last, after despairing, breathless screaming, and vain sucking, things went right, and mother and child felt simultaneously soothed, and both subsided into calm. "But poor darling, he's all in perspiration," said Kitty in a whisper, touching the baby. "What makes you think he knows you?" she added, with a sidelong glance at the baby's eyes that peered roguishly, as she fancied, from under his cap at his rhythmically puffing cheeks and the little red-palmed hand he was waving. "Impossible. If he knew anyone, he would have known me," said Kitty in response to Agafea Mikhailovna's statement, and she smiled. She smiled because, though she said he could not know her, in her heart she was sure that he knew not merely Agafea Mikhailovna, but that he knew and understood everything, and knew and understood a great deal, too, that no one else knew, and that she, his mother, had learned and come to understand only through him. To Agafea Mikhailovna, to the nurse, to his grandfather, to his father even, Mitya was a living being, requiring only material care, but for his mother he had long been a mortal being, with whom there had been a whole series of spiritual relations already. When he wakes up, please God, you shall see for yourself. Then when I do like this, he simply beams on me, the darling, simply beams like a sunny day, said Agafea Mikhailovna. Well, well, then we shall see, whispered Kitty. But now, go away. He's going to sleep. End of chapter 6. Okay, so, sorry, baby. Welcome to being a guy. So we have a little slice of life with Kitty being a mom, and she has just such a motherly connection to the child that she can even know when the child is about to scream, or just know that the child is upset when they are like very far apart in the house. And also she just knows when her kid Mitya is going to be hungry. She just knows. Her body is just responding to it. And so it's interesting seeing her in this like maternal role. And I think that it's funny that like babies are like little sponges. They just like pick up everything. And yes, they do have, recognition pretty early on as like a like survival skill. And so like I just think it's funny that like Kitty not being jealous, but like, why would he recognize you? Why would my baby recognize you? Type of a thing. And I think it's so interesting also that like Agafea Mikhailovna and Kitty are still having this like almost strained, almost like back and forth relationship, instead of them just being like synced together and just being like, oh yeah, like we have the same goals, this is what we want, but like still butting heads every once in a while. And so like Kitty just so desperately wants it to be like, why would he recognize you? If he recognizes anybody, it's me, his mama. But she does know that, like, in her heart of hearts, that Mitya is actually picking up on everything, picking up on people, picking up on, like, the things that are happening around him, and even things that, like, adults don't know. Chapter 7. Agafea Mikhailovna went on tiptoe. The nurse let down the blind, chased a fly out from under the muslin canopy of the crib, and a bumblebee struggling on the window frame, and sat down, waving a faded branch of birch over the mother and the baby. How hot it is! If God would send a drop of rain. Yes, yes, shh, 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 was all Kitty answered, rocking a little and tenderly squeezing the plump little arm, with rolls of fat at the wrist, which Mitya still waved feebly as he opened and shut his eyes. That hand worried Kitty. She longed to kiss the little hand, but was afraid to for fear of waking the baby. At last, the little hand ceased waving, and the eyes closed. Only from time to time, as he went on, the baby raised his long, curly eyelashes and peeped at his mother with wet eyes that looked back in the twilight. The nurse had left off fanning and was dozing. From above came the peals of the old prince's voice and the chuckle of Katavasov. They have got into talk without me, thought Kitty. But still, it's vexing that Kostya's out. He's sure to have gone to the bee-house again. Though it's a pity he's there so often. Still, I'm glad. It distracts his mind. He's become altogether happier and better now than in the spring. He used to be so gloomy and worried that I felt frightened for him. And how absurd he is, she whispered, smiling. She knew what worried her husband. It was his unbelief. Although, if she had been asked whether she supposed that in the future life, if he did not believe, he would be damned, she would have had to admit that he would be damned. His unbelief did not cause her unhappiness. And she, confessing that for an unbeliever there can be no salvation, and loving her husband's soul more than anything in the world, thought with a smile of his unbelief, and told herself that he was absurd. What does he keep reading philosophy of some sort for all this year? She wondered. If it's all written in those books, he can understand them. If it's all wrong, why does he read them? He says himself that he would like to believe. Then why is it he doesn't believe? Surely from his thinking so much. And he thinks so much from being solitary. He's always alone. Alone. He can't talk about it all to us. I fancy he'll be glad of these visitors, especially Katavasov. He likes discussion with them, she thought, and passed instantly to the consideration of where it would be more convenient to put Katavasov, to sleep alone or to share Sergei Ivanovitch's room. And then an idea suddenly struck her, which made her shudder and even disturb Mitya, who glanced severely at her. I do believe the laundress hasn't sent the washing yet, and all the best sheets are in use. If I don't see to it, Agafea Mikhailovna will give Sergei Ivanovitch the wrong sheets. And at the very idea of this, the blood rushed to Kitty's face. Yes, I will arrange it, she decided. And going back to her former thoughts, she remembered that some spiritual question of importance had been interrupted. And she began to recall what. Yes, Kostya, an unbeliever, she thought again with a smile. Well, an unbeliever then. Better let him always be one than like Madame Stahl, or what I tried to be in those days abroad. No, he won't ever sham anything. And a recent instance of his goodness rose vividly to her mind. A fortnight ago, a penitent letter had come from Stepan Arkadyevitch to Dolly. He besought her to save his honor, to sell her estate to pay his debts. Dolly was in despair. She detested her husband, despised him, pitied him, resolved on a separation, resolved to refuse, but ended by agreeing to sell part of her property. After that, with an irrepressible smile of tenderness, Kitty recalled her husband's shamefaced embarrassment. He repeated awkward efforts to approach the subject, and how, at last, having thought of the one means of helping Dolly without wounding her pride, he had suggested to Kitty what had not occurred to her before, that she should give up her share of the property. He, an unbeliever indeed, with his heart, his dread of offending anyone, even a child, everything for others, nothing for himself. Sergei Ivanovitch simply considers it as Kostya's duty to be his steward, and it's the same with his sister. Now Dolly and her children are under his guardianship. All these peasants who come to him every day as though he were bound to be at their service. Yes, only be like your father, only like him, she said, handing Mitya over to the nurse and putting her lips to his cheek. End of chapter 7. Chapter 7. Codependency in pre-revolutionary Russia. Wild. Okay, so Kitty is having a little discussion of herself, or with herself, about Levin and his lack of belief. And she's like, oh, well, he used to be a non-believer, even though he reads all of these books, and I know that he wants to be a believer, but he has to be a believer because he's actually doing good things for good people. So if that's not being a believer, I don't know what is. And then she has a moment with her little babes, and she's like, oh, little baby, you need to only be like your papa, and then like puts him down, which I think is a little sweet. That's cute. I mean, that's what you should want, right? You should want your little bubsy to like grow up like you and your partner. Yeah, and Kitty is still, like, very preoccupied with, like, managing the house and being like, oh, we can't give them the wrong sheets. How embarrassing. And that was that chapter. Chapter 8. Ever since, by his beloved brother's deathbed, Levin had first glance into the questions of life and death in the light of these new convictions, as he called them, which had, during the period of his 20th to his 34th year, imperceptibly replaced his childish and youthful beliefs. He had been stricken with horror, not so much of death as of life, without any knowledge of whence and why and how and what it was. The physical organization, its decay, the indestructibility of matter, the law of the conservation of energy, evolution, were the words which usurped the place of his old belief. These words and the ideas associated with them were very well for intellectual purposes. But for life they yielded nothing, and Levin felt suddenly like a man who has changed his warm fur cloak for a muslin garment, and going for the first time into the frost is immediately convinced, not by reason, but by his whole nature, that he is as good as naked, and that he must infallibly perish miserably. From that moment, though he did not distinctly face it, and still went on living as before, Levin had never lost this sense of terror at his lack of knowledge. He vaguely felt, too, that when he called his new convictions were not merely lack of knowledge, but that they were part of a whole order of ideas, in which no knowledge of what he needed was possible. At first, marriage, with the new joys and duties bound up with it, had completely crowded out these thoughts. But of late, while he was staying in Moscow after his wife's confinement with nothing to do, the question that clamored for solution had more and more often, more and more insistently, haunted Levin's dreams, Levin's mind. The question was summoned up for him thus: if I do not accept the answers Christianity gives to the problems of my life, what answers do I accept? And in the whole arsenal of his convictions, so far from finding any satisfactory answers, he was utterly unable to find anything at all like an answer. He was in the position of a man seeking food in toy shops and tool shops. Instinctively, unconsciously, with every book, with every conversation, with every man he met, he was on the lookout for light on these questions and their solution. What puzzled and distracted him above everything was that the majority of men of his age and circle had, like him, exchanged their old beliefs for the same new convictions, and yet saw nothing to lament in this, and were perfectly satisfied and serene, so that, apart from the principal question, Levin was tortured by other questions too. Were these people sincere? He asked himself, or were they playing a part? Or was it that they understood the answers science gave to these problems in some different, clearer sense than he did? And he assiduously studied both these men's opinions and the books which treated of these scientific explanations. One fact he had found out since these questions had engrossed his mind was that he had been quite wrong in supposing from the recollections of the circle of his young days at college that religion had outlived its day, and that it was now practically non-existent. All the people nearest to him, who were good in their lives, were believers. The old prince and Lvov, whom he liked so much, and Sergei Ivanovich, and all the women believed, and his wife believed as simply as he had believed in his earliest childhood. And 99 hundredths of the Russian people, all the working people for whose life he felt the deepest respect, believed. Another fact of which he became convinced after reading many scientific books was that the man who shared his views had no other construction to put on them, and that they gave no explanation of the questions which he felt he could not live without answering, but simply ignored their existence and attempted to explain other questions of no possible interest to him, such as the evolution of organisms, the materialistic theory of consciousness, and so forth. Moreover, during his wife's confinement, something had happened that seemed extraordinary to him. He was an unbeliever, had fallen into praying, and at the moment he prayed, he believed. But that moment had passed, and he could not make his state of mind at that moment fit into the rest of his life. He could not admit that at that moment he knew the truth and that now he was wrong, for as soon as he began thinking calmly about it, it all fell to pieces. He could not admit that he was mistaken then, for his spiritual condition then was precious to him, and to admit that it was a proof of weakness would have been to desecrate those moments. He was miserably divided against himself, and strained all his spiritual forces to the utmost to escape from this condition. End of chapter 8. Okay, chapter 8. Okay, so in chapter 7 we have Kitty who's like, he's a believer, but he's not a believer. But is he a believer? How can he not be a believer when he's a good person and does things for other people? And then in this chapter we have Levin having like the same conversation but from his perspective about himself, and just like seeing everybody around him that are believers and the people who have the same mindset as him reading the scientific books and seeing that they're not really adding anything to the conversation. And so, like, is he a believer? Is he not a believer? Is he, like, just questions. Just religious questions. Interesting. Chapter 9. Let's do it. These doubts fretted and harassed him, growing weaker or stronger from time to time, but never leaving him. He read and thought, and the more he read and the more he thought, the further he felt from the aim he was pursuing. Of late in Moscow and in the country, since he had become convinced that he would find no solution in the materialists, he had read and reread thoroughly Plato, Spinoza, Kant, Schelling, Hegel, and Schopenhauer, the philosophers who gave a non-materialistic explanation of life. Their ideas seemed to him fruitful when he was reading or was himself seeking arguments to refute other theories, especially those of the materialists. But as soon as he began to read or sought for himself a solution of problems, the same thing always happened. As long as he followed the fixed definition of obscure words such as spirit, will, freedom, essence, purposely letting himself go into the snare of words the philosophers set for him, he seemed to comprehend something. But he had only to forget the artificial train of reasoning and to turn from life itself to what has satisfied him while thinking in accordance with the fixed definitions, and all this artificial edifice fell to pieces at once like a house of cards, and it became clear that the edifice had been built up out of those transposed words, apart from anything in life more important than reason. His brother, Sergei Ivanovich, advised him to read the theological works of Homyakov. Levin read the second volume of Homyakov's works, and in spite of the elegant, epigrammatic, argumentative style, which at first repelled him, he was impressed by the doctrine of the Church he found in them. He was struck at first by the idea that the apprehension of divine truths had not been vouchsafed to man, but to a corporation of man bound together by love, to the Church. What delighted him was the thought how much easier it was to believe in a still existing living church, embracing all the beliefs of men and having God at its head, and therefore holy and infallible, and from it to accept the faith in God, in the creation, the fall, the redemption, that to begin with God, a mysterious, far-away God, the creation, etc. But afterwards, on reading a Catholic writer's history of the Church, and then a Greek Orthodox writer's history of the Church, and seeing that the two churches, in their very conception infallible, each deny the authority of the other, Homyakov's doctrine of the Church lost all its charm for him, and this edifice crumbled into dust like the philosophers' edifices. All that spring he was not himself, and went through fearful moments of horror. Without knowing what I am and why I am here, life's impossible, and that I can't know, and so I can't live, Levin said to himself. In infinite time, in infinite matter, in infinite space is formed a bubble organism, and that bubble lasts a while and bursts, and that bubble is me. It was an agonizing error, but it was the sole logical result of ages of human thought in that direction. This was the ultimate belief on which all the systems elaborated by human thought in almost all their ramifications rested. It was the prevalent conviction, and of all other explanations Levin had unconsciously, not knowing when or how, chosen it, as anyway the clearest, and made it his own. This was the ultimate belief on which all the systems elaborated by human thought in almost all their ramifications rested. It was the prevalent conviction, and of all other explanations Levin had unconsciously, not knowing when or how, chosen it, as always the clearest, and made it his own. But it was not merely a falsehood. It was the cruel jeer of some wicked power, some evil, hateful power, to whom one could not submit. He must escape from this power, and the means of escape every man had in his own hands. He had but to cut short this dependence on evil, and there was one means: death. And Levin, a happy father and husband in perfect health, was several times so near suicide that he hit the cord that he might not be tempted to hang himself, and was afraid to go out with his gun for fear of shooting himself. But Levin did not shoot himself, and did not hang himself. He went on living. End of chapter 9. Levin? Okay. Levin is contemplating religion, and he has questions, and so to get answers, he is seeking a bunch of different texts, and from a bunch of different orthodoxies, and finding that maybe religion and believing in the church isn't the same now as what it used to be. Like, back then, it was like a real thing, but now, is it real? I don't know. And the only way to prove this is death. And Levin talks about, like, his ideation a couple times, and he's like, but I'm healthy, I am a happy father, I am a happy husband, so not now. So I guess that means that he can't prove religion is a thing, and he's okay with it. Have we accepted this, Levin? Levin, my dude, you alright? You okay, bud? So, chapter 10. When Levin thought what he was and what he was living for, he could find no answer to the questions and was reduced to despair. But he left off questioning himself about it. It seemed as though he knew both what he was and for what he was living, for he acted and lived resolutely and without hesitation. Indeed, in these latter days, he was far more decided and unhesitating in life than he had ever been. When he went back to the country at the beginning of June, he went back also to his usual pursuits: the management of the estate, his relations with the peasants and the neighbors, the care of his household, the management of his sisters' and brothers' property, of which he had the direction, his relations with his wife and kindred, the care of his child, and the new beekeeping hobby he had taken up that spring filled all his time. These things occupied him now, not because he justified them to himself by any sort of general principles as he had done in former days. On the contrary, disappointed by the failure of his former efforts for the general welfare, and too much occupied with his own thought and the mass of business with which he was burdened from all sides, he had completely given up thinking of the general good, and he busied himself with all his work simply because it seemed to him that he must do what he was doing, that he could not do otherwise. In former days, almost from childhood and increasingly up to full manhood, when he had tried to do anything that would be good for all, for humanity, for Russia, for the whole village, he had decided that the idea of it had been pleasant. but the work itself had always been incoherent. That he had never had a full conviction of its absolute necessity, and that the work that had begun by seeming so great had grown less and less, till it vanished into nothing. By now, since his marriage, when he had begun to confine himself more and more to living for himself, though he experienced no delight at all at the thought of the work he was doing, he felt a complete conviction of its necessity, saw that it succeeded far better than in old days, and that it kept on growing more and more. Now, involuntarily, it seemed, he cut more and more deeply into the soil like a plow, so that he could not be drawn out without turning aside the furrow. To live the same family life as his father and forefathers, that is, in the same condition of culture, and to bring up his children in the same, was incontestably necessary. It was as necessary as dining when one was hungry. And to do this, just as it was necessary to cook dinner, it was necessary to keep the mechanism of agriculture at Pokrovsko going so as to yield in income. Just as incontestably as it was necessary to repay a debt, was it necessary to keep the property in such a condition that his son, when he received it as a heritage, would say, "Thank you," to his father, as Levin had said, "Thank you," to his grandfather for all he built and planted. And to do this, it was necessary to look after the land himself, not to let it, and to breed cattle, manure the fields, and plant timber. It was impossible not to look after the affairs of Sergei Ivanovich, of his sister, of the peasants who came to him for advice and were accustomed to do so, as possible as to fling down a child one is carrying in one's arms. It was necessary to look after the comfort of his sister-in-law and her children, and of his wife and baby, and it was impossible not to spend with them at least a short time each day. And all this, together with shooting and his new beekeeping, filled up the whole of Levin's life, which had no meaning at all for him when he began to think. But besides knowing thoroughly what he had to do, Levin knew in just the same way how he had to do it all, and what was more important than the rest. He knew he must hire laborers as cheaply as possible, but to hire men under bond, paying them in advance at less than the current rate of wages, was what he must not do, even though it was very profitable. Selling straws to the peasants in times of scarcity of provender was what he must do, even though he felt sorry for them. The tavern and the pothouse must be put down, though they were a source of income. Felling timber must be punished as severely as possible, but he could not exact forfeits for cattle being driven onto his fields. And though it annoyed the keeper and made the peasants not afraid to graze their cattle on his land, he could not keep their cattle as a punishment. To Pyotr, who was paying a moneylender 10% a month, he must lend a sum of money to set him free. But he could not let off peasants who did not pay their rent, nor let them fall into arrears. It was impossible to overlook the bailiffs not having mown the meadows and letting the hay spoil. And it was equally impossible to mow those acres where a young copse had been planted. It was impossible to excuse a laborer who had gone home in the busy season because his father was dying, however sorry he might feel for him, and he must subtract from his pay those costly months of idleness. But it was impossible not to allow monthly rations to the old servants who were of no use for anything. Levin knew that when he got home he must first of all go to his wife, who was unwell, and that the peasants who had been waiting for 3 hours to see him could wait a little longer. He knew, too, that regardless of all the pleasure he felt in taking a swarm, he must forego that pleasure and leave the old man to see the bees alone, while he talked to the peasants who had come after him to the bee house. Whether he were acting rightly or wrongly, he did not know, and far from trying to prove that he was, nowadays he avoided all thought or talk about it. Reasoning had brought him to doubt and prevented him from seeing what he ought to do and what he ought not. When he did not think, but simply lived, he was continually aware of the presence of an infallible judge in his soul, determining which of two possible courses of action was the better and which was the worse. And as soon as he did not act rightly, he was at once aware of it. So he lived, not knowing and not seeing any chance of knowing what he was and what he was living for, and harassed at his lack of knowledge to such a point that he was afraid of suicide, and yet firmly laying down his own individual, definite path in life. End of chapter 10. Oh, Levin. Oh, Levin. I actually really enjoyed this Levin chapter. I know. Let me tell you why. His existentialism is so vast, but so rightly displayed that it just like transcends generations and transcends, anybody's experiences because I feel like it is such a universal theme that it resonates. And like his questioning religion also comes into question of like, okay, but like what am I doing? And when he stops to think, he doesn't know, he knows that he can't answer that. He knows that he doesn't know why he's here. He doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing. And so to distract himself from the existential crisis, he's just making himself busier. He's just working constantly, and he's like adding beekeeping. He's adding all of these other readings to like keep his brain going, and in his idleness is when he is alone with these thoughts, and so he tries not to do that. And the decisions that he is making of like seeing his wife Kitty and like, taking in the sister-in-law and like being sad for peasants who have loss in their family are not driven by religion, which Kitty earlier stated, like, oh, but his heart is so big. Like, how can he not be a believer when he's doing so much good for other people? And Levin is like, of course I'm going to do that. Like, it only makes sense. It would be impossible for me not to do that. But he's not doing it out of religion. He's just doing it because, like, it makes sense to him. And it is wild. Wild. We are Levin. Near the end of last year's proceedings into the beginning of this year's, 11 hits a bit hard. And I'm wondering, so we do get a lot of Levin, and we do get a lot of internal dialogue and conflict with Levin. And I'm wondering if this is the character that is the closest, having not looked anything up surrounding the book, but I'm wondering if it is the closest to Tolstoy's existentialism. Like we already talked about, like Tolstoy, like questioning his religion and the like societal norms and everything like that. So it is the closest to Tolstoy. Cool. Yeah, you can definitely tell that Tolstoy is giving a bit more care into Levin. Does this mean that we wouldn't like Tolstoy in real life? Chapter 11. The day on which Sergei Ivanovich came to Pokrovskoe was one of Levin's most painful days. It was the very busiest working time, when all the peasantry show an extraordinary intensity of self-sacrifice in labor, such as is never shown in any other conditions of life, and would be highly esteemed if the men who showed these qualities themselves thought highly of them, and if it were not repeated every year, and if the results of this intense labor were not so simple. To reap and bind the rye and oats, and to carry it, to mow the meadows, turn over the fallows, thrash the seeds, and sow the winter corn. All this seems so simple and ordinary, but to succeed in getting through it all, everyone in the village, from the old man to the young child, must toil incessantly for 3 or 4 weeks, 3 times as hard as usual, living on rye beer, onions, and black bread, thrashing and carrying the sheaves at night, and not giving more than 2 or 3 hours in the 24 to sleep. And every year This is done all over Russia. Having lived the greater part of his life in the country and in the closest relations with the peasants, Levin always felt in this busy time that he was infected by this general quickening of energy in the people. In the early morning, he rode over to the first sowing of the rye and to the oats, which were being carried to the stacks, and returning home at the time his wife and sister-in-law were getting up. He drank coffee with them and walked to the farm, where a new thrashing machine was to be set, working to get ready the seed corn. He was standing in the cool granary, still fragrant with the leaves of the hazel branches interlaced on the freshly peeled aspen beams of the new thatch roof. He gazed through the open door in which the dry, bitter dust of the thrashing whirled and played, at the grass of the thrashing floor in the sunlight, and the fresh straw that had been brought in from the barn, then at the speckly-headed, white-breasted swallows that flew chirping in under the roof and, fluttering their wings, settled in the crevices of the doorway, then at the peasants bustling in the dark, dusty barn, and he thought strange thoughts. Why is it all being done? He thought. Why am I standing here, making them work? What are they all so busy for, trying to show their zeal before me? What is that old Matrona, my old friend, toiling for? I doctored her when the beam fell on her in the fire, he thought, looking at a thin old woman who was raking up the grain, moving painfully with her bare, sun-blackened feet over the uneven, rough floor. Then she recovered, but today or tomorrow or in 10 years she won't. They'll bury her, and nothing will be left either of her or of that smart girl in the red jacket, who with that skillful, soft action shakes the ears out of their husks. They'll bury her, and this piebald horse, and very soon, he thought, gazing at the heavily moving, panting horse that kept walking up the wheel that turned under him. And they will bury her, and Fyodor, the thrasher, with his curly beard full of chaff, and his shirt torn on his white shoulders. They will bury him. His untying the sheaves, and giving orders and shouting to the women, and quickly setting straight the strap on the moving wheel. And what's more, it's not them alone. Me they'll bury too, and nothing will be left. What for? He thought this, and at the same time looked at his watch to reckon how much they thrashed in an hour. He wanted to know this so as to judge by it the task to set for the day. It'll soon be one, and they're only beginning the third sheaf, thought Levin. He went up to the man that was feeding the machine and shouted over the roar of the machine he had told them to put in more slowly. You put in too much at a time, Fyodor. Do you see? It gets choked. That's why it isn't getting on. Do it evenly. Fyodor, black with the dust that clung to his moist face, shouted something in response, but still went on doing it as Levin did not want him to. Levin, going up to the machine, moved Fyodor aside and began feeding the corn in himself, working on till the peasants' dinner hour, which was not long in coming. He went out of the barn with Fyodor and fell into talk with him, stopping beside a neat yellow sheaf of rye laid on the thrashing floor for feed. Fyodor came from a village at some distance from the one in which Levin had once allotted land to his cooperative association. Now it had been let to a former house porter. Levin talked to Fyodor about this land and asked whether Platon, a well-to-do peasant of good character belonging to the same village, would not take the land for the coming year. It's a high rent. It wouldn't pay, Konstantin Dmitrievich, answered the peasant, picking the ears off his sweat-drenched shirt. But how does Krylov make it pay? Mita, so the peasant called the house porter in a tone of contempt. You may be sure he'll make it pay, Konstantin Dmitrievich. He'll get his share, however he has to squeeze to get it. He's no mercy on a Christian, but Uncle Falconich, so he called the old peasant Platon. Do you suppose he'd flay the skin off a man? Where there's debt, he'll let anyone off, and he'll not wring the last penny out. He's a man, too. But why will he let anyone off? Oh, well, of course, folks are different. One man lives for his own wants and nothing else. Like Mitta, he only thinks of filling his belly. But Fakanich is a righteous man. He lives for his soul. He does not forget God. How thinks of God? How does he live for his soul? Levin almost shouted. Why, to be sure, in truth, in God's way. Folks are different. Take you now. You wouldn't wrong a man. Yes, goodbye, said Levin, breathless with excitement, and turning round he took his stick and walked quickly away towards home. At the peasant's words that Fakanich lived for his soul, in truth, in God's way, undefined but significant ideas seemed to burst out as though they had been locked up and all striving towards one goal. They thronged, whirling through his head, blinding him with their light. End of chapter 11. All right, chapter 11. We have Levin getting the land ready, and they have to do it every year, and it's backbreaking work, but it's not like hard. It's just kind of like on autopilot work, but it is like manual labor. And he's looking around and having all of these thoughts, and he's like, you're gonna die. They're gonna bury you one day. They'll bury you one day. Why are you even here? And you know what? They're gonna bury me one day. What's the point? And then he starts talking to one of the peasants, one of the laborers, and they're getting to talking, and he mentions somebody else, and he's like, well, yeah, like this other guy is a religious guy, and he just lives in God's way. And it's very vague, the description of it, and Levin is like, ding, 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 like a light bulb goes off. Chapter 12. Levin strode along the high road, absorbed not so much in his thoughts, he could not yet disentangle them, as in his spiritual condition, unlike anything he had experienced before. The words uttered by the peasant had acted on his soul like an electric shock, suddenly transforming and combining into a single whole, the whole swarm of disjointed, impotent, separate thoughts that incessantly occupied his mind. These thoughts had unconsciously been in his mind, even when he was talking about the land. He was aware of something new in his soul, and joyfully tested this new thing, not yet knowing what it was. Not living for his own wants, but for God. For what God? And could one say anything more senseless than what he said? He said that one must not live for one's own want. That is, that one must not live for what we understand, what we are attracted by, what we desire, but must live for something incomprehensible, for God, whom no one can understand, nor even define. What of it? Didn't I understand those senseless words of Fyodor's? And understanding them, did I doubt of their truth? Did I think them stupid, obscure, inexact? No, I understood him, and exactly as he understands the words. I understood them more fully and clearly than I understand anything in life, and never in my life have I doubted, nor can I doubt about it. And not only I, but everyone. The whole world understands nothing fully but this, and about this only they have no doubt and are always agreed. And I looked out for miracles, complained that I did not see a miracle which would convince me. A material miracle would have persuaded me, and here is a miracle, the sole miracle possible, continually existing and surrounding me on all sides, and I never noticed it. Fyodor says that Kirillov lives for his belly. That's comprehensible and rational. All of us, as rational beings, can't do anything else but live for our belly. And all of a sudden, the same Fyodor says that one mustn't live for one's belly, but must live for truth, for God. And at a hint, I understand him. And I and millions of men who lived ages ago and men living now, peasants, the poor in spirit and the learned, who have thought and written about in their obscure words, saying the same thing, we are all agreed about this one thing, what we must live for and what is good. I and all men have only one firm, incontestable, clear knowledge, and that knowledge cannot be explained by the reason. It is outside it, and it has no causes and can have no effects. If goodness has causes, it is not goodness. If it has effects, a reward, it is not goodness either. So goodness is outside the chain of cause and effect, and yet I know it, and we all know it. What could be a greater miracle than that? Can I have found the solution of it all? Can my sufferings be over? Thought Levin, striding along the dusty road, not noticing the heat, nor his weariness, and experiencing a sense of relief from prolonged suffering. This feeling was so delicious that it seemed to him incredible. He was breathless with emotion and incapable of going farther. He turned off the road into the forest and lay down in the shade of an aspen on the uncut grass. He took his hat off his hot head and lay propped on his elbow in the lush, feathery woodland grass. Yes, I must make it clear to myself and understand, he thought, looking intently at the untrampled grass before him and following the movements of a green beetle advancing along a blade of couch grass and lifting up in its progress a leaf of goatweed. What have I discovered? He asked himself, bending aside the leaf of goatweed out on the beetle's way and twisting another blade of grass above for the beetle to cross over onto it. What is it makes me glad? What have I discovered? I have discovered nothing. I have only found out what I knew. I understand the force that in the past gave me life and now too gives me life. I have been set free from falsity. I have found the master. Of old, I used to say that in my body, that in the body of this grass and of this beetle, there, she didn't care for the grass, she opened her wings and flown away. There was going on a transformation of matter in accordance with physical, chemical, and physiological laws. And in all of us, as well as in the aspens and the clouds and the misty patches, there was a process of evolution. Evolution from what? Into what? Eternal evolution and struggle, as though there could be any sort of tendency and struggle in the eternal. And I was astonished that in spite of the utmost effort of thought along that road, I could not discover the meaning of life, the meaning of my impulses and yearnings. Now, I say that I know the meaning of life, to live for God, for my soul. And this meaning, in spite of its clearness, is mysterious and marvelous. Such, indeed, is the meaning of everything existing. Yes, pride, he said to himself, turning over on his stomach and beginning to tie a noose of blades of grass, tying not to break them. And not merely pride of intellect, but dullness of intellect, and most of all the deceitfulness, yes, the deceitfulness of intellect, the cheating knavishness of intellect. That's it, he said to himself, and he briefly went through, mentally, the whole course of his ideas during the last 2 years, the beginning of which was the clear confrontation of death at the sight of his dear brother hopelessly ill. Then, for the first time, grasping that for every man and himself, too, there was nothing in store but suffering, death, and forgetfulness. He had made up his mind that life was impossible like that, and that he must either interpret life so that it would not present itself to him as the evil jest of some devil, or shoot himself. But he had not done either, but had gone on living, thinking, and feeling, and had even at that very time married, and had had many joys, and had been happy, when he was not thinking of the meaning of life. What did this mean? It meant that he had been living rightly, but thinking wrongly. He had lived, without being aware of it, on those spiritual truths that he had sucked in with his mother's milk, but he had thought, not merely without recognition of these truths, but studiously ignoring them. Now it was clear to him that he could only live by virtue of the beliefs in which he had been brought up. What should I have been? And how should I have spent my life if I had not had these beliefs, if I had not known that I must live for God and not my own desires? I should have robbed and lied and killed. Nothing of what makes the chief happiness of my life would have existed for me. and with the utmost stretch of imagination, he could not conceive the brutal creature he would have been himself if he had not known what he was living for. I look for an answer to my question, and thought could not give an answer to my question. It is incommensurable with my question. The answer has been given me by life itself, in my knowledge of what is right and what is wrong, and that knowledge I did not arrive at in any way. It was given to me as to all men, given, because I could not have got it from anywhere. Where could I have got it? By reason could I have arrived at knowing that I must love my neighbor and not oppress him? I was told that in my childhood, and I believed it gladly, for they told me what was already in my soul. But who discovered it? Not reason. Reason discovered the struggle for existence and the law that requires us to oppress all who hinder the satisfaction of our desires. That is the deduction of reason. But loving one's neighbor, reason could never discover, because it's irrational. End of chapter 12. Yeah, so Levin is, again, wrangling with, religion, existentialism, but being good, but where did the reason come from? Am I supposed to be, I'm supposed to be living outside of myself and living for other people, and I was told that as a wee little babe, but they saw it in my soul that I was already doing that. But the things that give me joy aren't the things necessarily that are living for other people. So am I supposed to live for other people, or am I supposed to be content and happy with myself? Because when I sit with either of these thoughts, I'm not doing either. And I'm just kind of working. Impulse versus discipline. Yeah. The classic existential struggle. Chapter 13. And Levin remembered a scene he had lately witnessed between Dolly and her children. The children, left to themselves, had begun cooking raspberries over the candles and squirting milk into each other's mouths with a syringe. Their mother, catching them at these pranks, began reminding them in Levin's presence of the trouble their mischief gave to the grown-up people, and that this trouble was all for their sake, and that if they smashed the cups, they would have nothing to drink their tea out of, and that if they wasted the milk, they would have nothing to eat and die of hunger. And Levin had been struck by the passive, weary incredulity with which the children heard what their mother said to them. They were simply annoyed that their amusing play had been interrupted, and did not believe a word of what their mother was saying. They could not believe it indeed, for they could not take in the immensity of all they habitually enjoyed, and so could not conceive that what they were destroying was the very thing they lived by. That all comes of itself, they thought, and there's nothing interesting or important about it, because it has always been so and always will be so, and it's all always the same. We've no need to think about it. It's all ready. But we want to invent something on our own and new, so we thought of putting raspberries in a cup and cooking them over a candle and squirting milk straight into each other's mouths. That's fun, and something new, and not a bit worse than drinking out of cups. Isn't it just the same that we do, that I did, searching by the aid of reason for the significance of the forces of nature and the meaning of life of man? He thought. And don't all the theories of philosophy do the same? Trying by the path of thought, which is strange and not natural to man, to bring him to a knowledge of what he has known long ago and knows so certainly that he could not live at all without it. Isn't it distinctly to be seen in the development of each philosopher's theory that he knows what is chief significance of life beforehand, just as positively as the peasant Fyodor, and not a bit more clearly than he, and is simply trying by a dubious intellectual path to come back to what everyone knows? Now then, leaving Leave the children to themselves to get things alone and make their crockery, get the milk from the cows and so on. Would they be naughty then? Why? They'd die of hunger. Well then, leave us with our passions and thoughts without any idea of the one God, of the Creator, or without any idea of what is right, without any idea of moral evil. Just try and build up anything without those ideas. We only try to destroy them because we're spiritually provided for, exactly like the children. Once have I that joyful knowledge shared with the peasant that alone gives peace to the soul. Whence did I get it? Brought up with an idea of God, a Christian, my whole life filled with the spiritual blessings Christianity has given me, full of them, and living on those blessings like the children I did not understand them, and destroy, that is try to destroy, what I live by. And as soon as an important moment of life comes, like the children when they are cold and hungry, I turn to him, and even less than the children when their mother scolds them for their childish mischief, do I feel that my childish efforts at wanton madness are reckoned against me. Yes, what I know not by reason, but it has been given to me, revealed to me, and I know it with my heart, by faith in the chief thing taught by the church. The church, Levin repeated himself. He turned over on the other side and, leaning on his elbow, fell to gazing into the distance at a herd of cattle crossing over the river. But can I believe in all the church teaches? He thought, trying himself, and thinking of everything that could destroy his present peace of mind. Intentionally he recalled all those doctrines of the church which had always seemed most strange and had always been a stumbling block to him. The creation. But how did I explain existence? By existence? By nothing? The devil and sin? But how do I explain evil? The atonement? But I know nothing. Nothing, and I can know nothing but what has been told to me and all men. And it seemed to him that there was not a single article of faith of the church which could destroy the chief thing, faith in God, in goodness, as the one goal of man's destiny. Under every article of faith of the church could be put the faith in the service of truth instead of one's desires, and each doctrine did not simply leave that faith unshaken. Each doctrine seemed essential to complete that great miracle, continually manifest upon earth, that made it possible for each man and millions of different sorts of men, wise men and imbeciles, old men and children, all men, peasants, love, kitty, beggars, and kings, to understand perfectly the same one thing, and to build up thereby that life of the soul which alone is worth living, and which alone is precious to us. Lying on his back, he gazed up now into the high, cloudless sky. Do I not know what this is, infinite space, and that it is not a round arch? But however I screw up my eyes and strain my sight, I cannot see it, not round and not bound. And in spite of my knowing about infinite space, I am incontestably right when I see a solid blue dome, and more right than when I strain my eyes to see beyond it. Levin ceased thinking, and only, as it were, listened to mysterious voices that seemed talking joyfully and earnestly within him. Can this be fate? He thought, afraid to believe in his happiness. My God, I thank thee, he said, gulping down his sobs and with both hands brushing away the tears that filled his eyes. End of chapter 13. All right, chapter 13, Levin is still with his thoughts, and he's coming to some sort of conclusion, maybe? He might be coming to a conclusion about how he's feeling. And he's like, okay, well, if something is the way that it is, then this is what has to happen. And if something is told to us, then this is the reason. And if something is this, then this is the this. And he's just going back and forth. And he even harkens his like thinking with the children who are just like making a mess and just having a good time. And he's like, okay, well, they don't know, like if the tables were turned and they had to fend for themselves, then they would die, because they're not doing things the best way. Like they're not getting, their own milk, and they're not like preserving the berries and all of these things. But if that was also the case, then they probably wouldn't be doing this thing. They would just know to do this. Like it's an innate instinctual thing. So he's like translating that idea to his thinking of religion and existentialism. Interesting. Tolstoy, I feel like, okay, Tolstoy. I got the pen. That means we're serious. We ended part 7, and we're like, oh no. Our main character, the one that everybody thinks of when they think of Anna Karenina, they obviously think of Anna, is no more. Let's wrap this up. Great. We did that in like 2, 3, maybe 5 chapters. And then everything else has just been like a thought experiment. Has just been Tolstoy sitting down and just not stream of consciousness. There's like editing and things going in, but just sitting down and plopping his thoughts. Tolstoy. Buddy. Buddy boy. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. As always, it has been a pleasure. Whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1,000% appreciate you. And I 1,000% appreciate your support. If I do not see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Bye!